The city lights flickered through the glass windows of my tiny apartment as I checked my phone for the 100th time that evening. 9:47 p.m. I should have been in bed by now, exhausted from another long day at work. But instead, I sat on the edge of my couch, staring at a message that had caught me off guard. "Come over. We need to talk." It was from Mr. Hayes, my boss, a man I had admired since the day I started my internship at the firm. He was charismatic, respected, and carried himself with a confidence I could only dream of. His mentorship had changed my career, but this message, it felt different, urgent, personal. A crisp autumn breeze drifted in from the slightly open window, making the room feel colder than it should. My hands tightened around my phone. Why so late? Was I in trouble? Had I made a mistake on the last project? Or was it something else? Shaking off the unease, I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The city was alive even at this hour, cars rushing by, distant laughter echoing from nearby bars. I walked briskly to his apartment, a sleek high-rise that towered over the quieter streets. I had been here once before for a company gathering, but tonight it felt different. The elevator ride was silent, each second stretching unbearably long. My heart pounded as I reached his door. Apartment 17B. The hallway was quiet, almost too quiet. I raised my hand to knock, but before I could, the door creaked open. And then, standing in the dim light, was Mr. Hayes, his usual polished demeanor slightly undone. His tie was missing, his shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal a side of him I had never seen before. "Come in," he said, his voice calm but unreadable. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. Something about this felt different, an unspoken tension lingering in the air. And yet I stepped inside. I had no idea that this night would change everything. The door clicked shut behind me, the soft sound cutting through the silence of the dimly lit apartment. A faint scent of cedarwood and something richer, maybe cologne, lingered in the air. Mr. Hayes turned toward the kitchen, his steps slow and deliberate, as if he was thinking through something carefully. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing toward the leather couch. His voice was steady, but something about his posture felt different tonight. Less like my authoritative boss, and more like a man carrying something unspoken. I sat down, my fingers pressing into the cool material beneath me. The apartment was sleek and modern, just as I had remembered, but tonight the atmosphere was different, more intimate. The usual distant professionalism between us was replaced by an unfamiliar energy, something I couldn't quite name. He poured himself a drink, whiskey neat, then turned, his sharp blue eyes meeting mine. "You've been doing good work, you know." He took a sip before continuing, his voice lower than usual. "Better than most of the junior associates, honestly." I swallowed hard, caught between pride and confusion. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." He smirked, shaking his head slightly. "You could drop the sir when we're not in the office." His words sent a strange ripple through me. In the months I had worked under him, Mr. Hayes had always been professional, sometimes even distant. But now, there was something personal in the way he spoke, the way he leaned slightly against the counter as he watched me. I shifted in my seat, my mind racing for answers. Why did he ask me here? What was he trying to say? He finally set his glass down and exhaled deeply. "Listen, there's something I've been meaning to talk to you about." The weight in his voice made my stomach twist. "Is everything okay?" I asked carefully. He hesitated. For the first time since I had met him, he looked uncertain, like he was debating whether to say something or keep it locked away. Finally, he ran a hand through his dark hair and let out a quiet chuckle, almost self-deprecating. "This isn't easy for me," he admitted. I stayed silent, waiting. He walked toward the couch, sitting down at the far end, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence, but far enough that an invisible line still remained between us. His fingers tapped absently against his knee, his jaw tightening, as if he was weighing his next words carefully. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," he said finally, his gaze fixed on the untouched drink in his hand. "Ambitious, focused, trying to prove something." I nodded, unsure where he was going with this. "I guess I do feel like I have something to prove." He glanced at me then, his expression unreadable. "And what is that?" I hesitated. That I belong. The words felt heavier than I intended, but they were the truth. In the corporate world, I often felt like I was still fighting for a seat at the table, still proving that I deserved to be here. Mr. Hayes studied me for a moment before nodding slowly. I know that feeling all too well. A silence settled between us, thick and charged. I should have said something, changed the subject, asked him why he called me here so late, but I couldn't. Something in his expression held me in place. You ever feel like you're holding something back? He asked suddenly, his voice quieter this time. The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? He let out a slow breath, leaning back against the couch. Like there's a part of yourself that you keep hidden, because you're not sure how people will react. The way he said it didn't feel hypothetical. It felt like a confession. My chest tightened. This conversation was no longer about work. Yeah, I admitted carefully. I think everyone does to some extent. His lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Some more than others. Another silence stretched between us, but this time it felt like neither of us wanted to break it. I could hear the quiet hum of the city outside, the distant sound of car horns and laughter drifting up from the streets below. Yet in this moment, it felt like the entire world had shrunk down to just this room, just the two of us. I had always looked up to Mr. Hayes, admired him, respected him. But now, sitting here in the dim glow of his apartment, I realized something I had never allowed myself to before. I was drawn to him. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to push the thought away. This was my boss, my mentor. Whatever this tension between us was, it was dangerous. But then he spoke again, his voice quieter than before. You ever wonder what would happen if you stopped holding back? The words sent a shiver through me. I turned to look at him, and for the first time, I saw it. The hesitation in his eyes, the unspoken question lingering in the air between us. And suddenly, I realized something else. I wasn't the only one feeling this. The room was dimly lit, the only source of illumination coming from the street lamp outside. Its glow flickered through the half-open blinds, casting shifting shadows along the walls. The silence between us was heavier than it had ever been, thick with something unspoken, something neither of us was ready to name. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud, insistent, almost deafening. My boss, Alex, stood across from me, his posture tense, his jaw tight. He was usually composed, always in control, but now he looked conflicted, as if he was fighting a battle within himself, the same war raging inside me. I swallowed hard. I should probably go. My voice barely broke the silence. Alex didn't move. His eyes, deep and unreadable, stayed locked on mine. He had always been a mentor to me, a guide, someone I respected, but tonight, everything felt different. The air between us was electric, charged with an energy I didn't understand, or maybe I did, but I was too afraid to admit it. I don't think you want to, he said finally, his voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant. My breath hitched. He was right. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want this moment to end. 1,000 thoughts ran through my head at once. Memories of the past months, the way his presence had always made me feel safe, the way he always seemed to see through me when no one else did. I had told myself it was admiration, respect, nothing more. But then why did it feel like the ground beneath me was shifting? Why did it feel like if I stepped closer, my entire world would change? He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, breaking eye contact for just a second before looking back at me with something raw in his expression. This wasn't supposed to happen. Neither of us had planned this. Neither of us had ever dared to cross the invisible line that had kept our relationship professional, safe. But here we were, standing on the edge of something unknown, something dangerous. I took a shaky step forward. The distance between us shrank, and with it, so did my resolve. Alex clenched his fists as if physically restraining himself. We can't, he murmured, but there was no conviction in his voice, no certainty in his words. I should have agreed. I should have turned around and walked away. But I didn't. I reached up, hesitating just inches away from touching him, from breaking whatever fragile barrier still remained. Then why does it feel like we already have? The moment stretched, the tension unbearable. And then, A knock at the door. The spell shattered instantly. Alex stepped back, his face unreadable once more. My pulse pounded as reality came crashing in. Who was at the door? Had someone seen us? The weight of the moment lingered between us, unresolved, hanging in the air like a question neither of us dared to answer. The knock at the door echoed through the apartment, shattering the fragile silence between us. I felt my entire body tense as reality came rushing in. My heart was still pounding from what had almost happened, from what we had nearly crossed into. Alex turned away sharply, his movements stiff and controlled. Without a word, he ran a hand over his face, composing himself before striding toward the door. I watched as he hesitated for just a second before pulling it open. A neighbor, an older woman, holding a package meant for him, smiling in that polite, distant way people do when they're unaware they've just interrupted something complicated. Alex thanked her, taking the package with a steady hand. If she noticed how rigid his posture was or how his voice was slightly strained, she didn't mention it. The door clicked shut, and then there was silence again. Except now it was different. Thicker, heavier, almost suffocating. Alex didn't turn back right away. He stood there, his back to me, gripping the package like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. And I didn't know what to do. I wanted to speak, to break the tension that had settled between us like an unspoken truth, but the words caught in my throat. What could I even say? A minute passed, maybe two. Then, finally, he turned. His face was unreadable again, the warmth and conflict that had been there moments ago buried beneath the carefully constructed mask he always wore. "This was a mistake," he said, his voice steady but distant. The words hit me like a cold wave. A mistake. I swallowed hard. "Alex." No, his tone was firm, cutting off whatever I had been about to say. He shook his head slightly, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Regret? Fear? It can't happen. I felt my stomach twist. "So we're just going to pretend?" "Yes." The answer came too quickly, too forcefully. His gaze hardened, and for the first time I saw something that almost looked like panic behind his eyes. "We're going to pretend this never happened." The words should have made sense. They should have been the right thing. But they weren't, because we both knew that something had shifted. And no matter how much we pretended, there was no going back. I exhaled shakily, feeling something inside me crack just a little. "If that's what you want." He didn't respond. Instead, he turned away again, running a hand through his hair, his breathing unsteady. And I knew, despite what he said, despite how much he wanted to push this down, bury it, he felt it too. But neither of us said another word. The weight of what had almost happened, what we had almost allowed, hung between us like an unfinished sentence, an unresolved note in a song that would never be completed. I grabbed my jacket, forcing my feet to move, forcing myself toward the door. I could still feel the ghost of the moment that had passed between us, lingering in the air like something fragile and fleeting. I hesitated, just for a second, before reaching for the handle. And then, without turning back, I walked out. The door shut behind me with a soft, final click, and everything felt different. The night air was sharp against my skin as I stepped outside. The world felt unchanged, indifferent. Cars still passed by, city lights still flickered in the distance, and people moved about their lives, unaware of the storm that had just torn through mine. I exhaled, watching the mist of my breath disappear into the night. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled my jacket tighter around myself. It wasn't from the cold. Alex's door remained closed behind me, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. As if he wasn't just on the other side, standing in his apartment, probably running a hand through his hair, probably thinking about everything and nothing all at once. I wanted to turn back, to knock, to make him face what had just happened, to make us face it. But I didn't. Instead, I walked. One step, then another, and another. Each one felt heavier than the last. My mind raced, replaying every moment. His touch, his hesitation, the way his voice had faltered when he said it was a mistake. Was it really? Or was that just fear talking? Would he wake up tomorrow and pretend none of it mattered? Would I? I reached the end of the street and stopped. Maybe this was it. Maybe he would let me go. Maybe we would go back to being what we were before. just a mentor and his employee. Just two people who had stepped too close to something dangerous and backed away before it consumed them. Or maybe this was just the beginning. I pulled out my phone, my fingers hovering over his name. Would he answer if I called? Would he let it ring? Would he be sitting there right now, staring at his own phone, wondering if I would reach out first? A sharp gust of wind pushed against me, urging me forward, urging me to make a choice. I inhaled deeply, my heart pounding as I pressed my thumb against the screen. And then, the screen went black. Battery dead. I stared at my reflection in the dark glass, my own uncertain expression staring back at me. Maybe it was a sign. Maybe I wasn't meant to call. Maybe this wasn't something that could be fixed with a conversation. Maybe the real question wasn't whether Alex would let me go. Maybe the real question was, would I be able to let him go? The city buzzed around me, but in that moment, everything felt suspended, like time itself was waiting for an answer neither of us was ready to give. And just like that, I turned and walked away. For now. But deep down I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Not even close.